Good morning, everyone. How y'all doing this morning? Oh, come on. You need more coffee? All right. Well, good morning. My name is Brittany Mellinger. I'm the Fair Housing Training and Outreach Coordinator at the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission, and thank you so much for joining us for this session. This session is titled Let's Talk, Demystifying the Reasonable Accommodation Process. So we're going to be having a freewheeling discussion discussing many different aspects of the reasonable accommodations and modifications for individuals with disabilities. So we know that the ability to make these requests under our fair housing protections enables individuals with disabilities the ability to obtain housing that meets their needs. And I know that we've got a wide variety of folks joining us for this conference, everyone from fair housing advocates to social service providers, housing providers, local government officials, and more. So we're going to be talking about this really broadly. And our goal is to discuss the real-life challenges and issues that pop up during these request processes. I know we're running a little bit behind on schedule today, so it's going to be a little bit of a shorter session, but we will still make sure to hold time at the end of the session for any questions that you might have. With that being said, let's get started. I'm so excited to welcome to the discussion this morning two fantastic speakers, Sharon McAllis and Olivia Benson. So I'm going to go ahead and read their bios so you have a sense of their background and where they're coming from. So first off, Olivia. Olivia Benson is the project manager for English SDHP's Regional Housing Coordinator Program. Olivia graduated with majors in neuroscience and sociology from UNC Chapel Hill and later received her master's degree in social work from Penn School of Social Work. Olivia has spent 5 years building her career portfolio with English SDHP, hired as a regional housing coordinator, promoted to senior regional housing coordinator, and is now managing her own team in eastern Pennsylvania. Olivia shares a deep commitment of advocating for others and believes wholeheartedly that housing is a human right. And Sharon McAllis is from the Disability Options Network, and she is the Westmoreland County lead for Disability Options Network Centers for Independent Living. Sharon advocates for those with disabilities, as well as offering resources to those with needs and in crisis. She has a degree in marketing and has worked in the mental health field. She not only navigates reasonable accommodations and renters' rights for others, but is also a renter dealing with it from the inside. All right, so to get us started, I'd like to invite you both to tell us a little bit about your organizations, what you do, and tell us a little bit about your role. So starting first with Olivia.
Hey, hi everyone, good morning. It's great to be here. What a rock star crowd already, I can tell. I am with English Self-Determination Housing of Pennsylvania. We merged with English about 3 years ago now. Actually, it might be 4. What is time? But our whole mission is to promote self-determination, which is essentially that folks know what's best for them, and they deserve to be able to choose all the options that are available to everyone else, right? So we do work across the state. I manage the Regional Housing Coordinator Program, which is sort of like social workers for social workers. So these are housing and disability experts throughout the state. Each county has an assigned RHC, Regional Housing Coordinator, to assist you. So whether that be fair housing questions around resource navigation, or maybe you have a specific case that you want advice on, that's what we're here to do. In addition, we also provide trainings on the housing world and the disability world. These are completely free. They're offered online on kind of a rolling basis, and we also do agency-specific trainings as well. So if you're interested in ever hosting us, we'd be happy to do that. Yeah, but I'll kick it over to Sharon.
Hello, good morning, everyone. As Brittany said, I work.
Maybe scoot that one over.
Give me a mic, that's dangerous. Can you hear me now? Yes, that's better, thank you. You're welcome. I work for Disability Options Network, which is a center for independent living. They're a nationwide program. We serve 7 counties, and the idea of the Center for Independent is helping individuals with disabilities to empower them and to improve their quality of life and also to achieve more independence and to empower them. We serve 5 core priorities or 5 core services that are information referral, transition services, independent skills, and peer support. I, along with the other team members, the other offices of the SEAL, we do all those 5 cores, but we also assist with housing, help them with the transition of moving from maybe a nursing home or a community where they didn't have quite as much independence to independently living on their own. And we also help them with transportation. I have a cool job and I really like it. It's I've got to do things. A few months ago when there was all the flooding and everything down south, there was a woman that got moved up here, but she had lost all her furniture. And I was able to help her advocate for herself, and she got a bed because she had disabilities. She had to have a special bed. We were able to help that. There's also just a few months ago, there's something called farmer markets certificates in Westmoreland County, and there's also renter's rebate. I helped a woman that, although she has disabilities, she's raising her grandson, and she was not able to figure out how to apply for the renter's rebate. I helped her, and she was able to buy back to school clothes for her grandson. So, and it's a very rewarding job. Sometimes we hit walls, but that's kind of what I do.
Fantastic. I can hear the passion from both of you and how much you love your work. So Olivia, I'm going to ask you next to help us lay the groundwork for our fair housing protections. What should folks know to kind of frame out this conversation?
Yeah, absolutely. So today we're really going to be narrowing in on reasonable accommodation. So this is specific to folks with disabilities within the Fair Housing Act. So a reasonable accommodation is a change in the rules, policies, practices, or services that will enable a person with disabilities an equal opportunity to enjoy a dwelling. So that includes housing providers, any part of the rental process, as well as the home buying process, so mortgage as well. Whether you're with a realtor, whether you're with your bank approving the mortgage, these are all covered by the Fair Housing Act. When it comes to reasonable accommodations, there does have to be a clear connection between the accommodation and the disability. So for example, a really common kind of accommodation that we all are probably familiar with are the accessible parking badges, right? So that's a change in the policy. Usually folks can't park that close, but because of this disability and they need that, that is sort of the ideal accommodation. Another one in practice would be, let's say a rental property does their application process in person, but their office isn't necessarily fully accessible. They can then accommodate the individual by having it virtual, having a virtual option, meeting them elsewhere, but changing that kind of policy that they usually have so that that person can equally apply.
All right, thank you. So Sharon, what are some accessibility barriers that you've seen with your consumers in their housing? What kind of issues have you seen arise?
One big issue is that people looking for housing that are ADA compatible or have developed the disability as they're living is if they rent, they ask the landlord and they say, oh, okay, you can do that, but I'm not paying for it. So it's hard for them because most of the people are on, you know, fixed income or a tight budget. So to actually find the resources, and a lot of the public does not know that there are resources out, but the only problem is the resources, there's limited monies, and there's more people than there is the monies. So that's the big thing. And the most common assistive devices would be, there are stair lifts, but common is the ramps and making the bathroom accessible.
Yeah, so I know you've both touched on a few different types of reasonable accommodations as well as modifications, with the accommodations being those changes in policies and the modifications being the actual changes to the structure, the physical changes. Are there any other ones that you'd want to highlight that come up in your work?
Yeah, I think a really interesting one and really important one that I want to make sure everyone knows is an option. We do see this quite often, that folks will advocate to change the due date of rent so that aligns with when they receive their disability income. Because it is connected, there's that clear connection between their disability and this accommodation. That's why we're able to change that sort of policy. Rent is still due every month, but just changing that due date can be a big support, especially for folks who receive a limited income once a month. Another really common one is providing large print applications, providing a Braille application, providing an interpreter throughout the application process. These are really reasonable, fine accommodations. Even when it comes to things such as housing choice vouchers, providing a private briefing with that voucher and that participant rather than a larger multi-person briefing so that they're able to ask more questions, get a bit more clarity. Another really common one that I know we're going to talk about soon is assistance animals. So allowing animals to live in a building that may be no pets allowed. But once again, when it's an assistance animal, there's a clear connection to the person with a disability. They're able to accommodate. So again, change that policy so that they're able to live with the animal they need.
Sharon, did you have anything to add to that?
No, I think she covered a wide variety.
Okay, fantastic. So I know we just brought up the topic of assistance animals, and whenever I'm out and doing training in the community, that's always something that I get a lot of questions about from housing providers on how to navigate those documentation issues and how to go about that process. So I'd like to ask you both to share a little bit about what assistance animals can do for individuals with disabilities, and talk a little bit about the documentation to establish that link between the individual with the disability and the disability-related need.
I think a lot of people get the line between service animal and assistant animals confused. Where a service animal is an animal, mostly a dog, that is trained specifically to help the individual with disability for a task or tasks, where an assistant animal is mostly there as an emotional support or to help guide them through and whatever their disability, if they're having anxiety, and help them calm down.
Yeah, so I think that is a huge kind of misunderstanding, is that assistance animals are only the service animal, right? And that they have to be specifically trained. But under the Fair Housing Act, there is no differentiation between a emotional support animal and a service animal. So they are both covered under the Fair Housing Act. That is not true for public spaces, and that is not true for airplanes. We're just talking about housing. So these animals can be, like Sharon mentioned, the guide dogs, formally trained, or emotional support animals. So the key here are that they are animals that work or assist to the benefit of the individual with disabilities. So They can also be there that improve the symptoms of a disability. So, for example, someone may have depression, right? And it can be difficult to get out of bed in the morning to feed themselves. But if you have a dog kind of whining in your ear, you're much more likely, I know I am, to get out of bed. You feed your pet, you feed yourself. Things like that, maybe that aren't as obvious as like a guide dog. You're not always going to see the purpose of the assistance animal, but that doesn't make it invalid. Now, a housing provider should never ask for medical documentation necessarily, so not their personal diagnoses or anything like that. They also cannot ask specifically what disability the individual has, just if they have one. So they can ask for a letter verifying that that this individual, the tenant, does require an assistance animal. Now, this can be from a social worker, it can be from a medical professional, a therapist, someone who's worked with them before. This letter lets them know how long you've worked with them, that the individual has a qualifying disability and requires this animal to live with them. That's it. It doesn't need to explain more. It doesn't need to share a specific diagnosis. Just establishing that, yes, this person does have a disability and needs this. So like I said, a landlord or a housing provider can ask for that letter, but again, no training is required, no certifications. There's a lot of kind of almost fake certifications out there. I think you can buy one on Amazon. What can't you buy on Amazon? Unfortunately. Yeah, so that is definitely a hot topic. Assistance animals can be any breed. They don't have to be just dogs either. They can be alligators, small enough, right? They still have to be reasonable. We've even seen things like miniature horses can be considered service animals. Some folks who need help, standing or getting out of bed. A dog's not necessarily strong enough, but a miniature horse could be. Still have to consider reasonableness, which we'll get into, and destruction of the property, etc. But yeah, that's definitely a hot topic, and we do have a training specific on assistance animals if you'd like to learn a bit more about them.
All right. So Sharon, I know that you've got a personal story to share about when you went through the reasonable accommodation process. Would you be able to share that with our audience?
Sure. I have 2 children. One has had multiple TBIs, and the youngest suffers from major depression. So the youngest psychiatrist suggested an emotional support animal. And just a sidebar, this cat has provided emotional support for all 3 of us. She was not trained. She was a stray that we adopted. When I approached the landlord with the letter stated exactly that my youngest needed this animal, and the diagnosis was on there. And the landlord looked at it and goes, well, I don't know. Give me a couple months to think about it.
Ooh.
And being an advocate, I knew you didn't have to have a couple months.
Mm-hmm.
And then he came back, well, I don't know about a cat. What about a guinea pig? I said, well, we already have a cat. And well, it depends on the sex. And I'll get back to you.
Mm.
And so then when I said, I said, we have this animal, we got a hat, we need it. And I said, we do have the documentation. Then he agreed. But he totally thought it was an optional and it was a nice thing. And he said, this is another person living with you. I said, this, according to the ADA, this doesn't mean that you can raise the rent. So that's my story.
Wow.
Yeah, it sounds like your experience in advocacy helped you to be able to stand up for the
Yeah.
rights that you knew that you had.
Because if I didn't, I wouldn't know.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly. Yeah, there's not a lot of education out there. And I think us as advocates need to let people know and communicate. That's the whole thing, I think, of today is communication.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, thank you for sharing your story. So speaking of denials of reasonable accommodation, there sometimes are legitimate reasons why these requests can be denied. Olivia, could you talk a little bit about what some of those reasons are?
Absolutely, yeah. So I know I got some eyebrows raised when I mentioned an alligator. That's actually based off a real case in Florida, of course. But there are still protections, of course, for housing providers. I know this might cause some anxiety. You're like, what do you mean? I have to let a pony in my house? Not necessarily. So there are kind of 4 aspects when it comes to reasonableness. So one is, does it cause undue financial and administrative burden to the housing provider or the municipality? So will it cost a lot? Will it take an additional staff person to maintain? 2, will it cause a fundamental alteration in the nature of the building? So, do they want a ramp up to the 3rd floor? That's not necessarily going to work, right? That's going to change the way the building looks. If a accommodation would cause harm or damage to others, this definitely comes up when we're talking about animals. They of course still need to be safe. They still need to have their vet and vaccine records. That's kind of protected by the state. And they still need to, of course, not be a threat to others. And then the 4th kind of dynamic here is it technologically possible? So can we actually make this accommodation or this modification? So those are kind of the reasons that something may be deemed unreasonable. So like I said, the miniature horse or the pony, it's going to be a bit unreasonable on the 3rd floor walk up, right? That's not necessarily going to work out. So there are still plenty of protections for folks, for the housing provider side of these, and those are sort of the reasons that one could be deemed unreasonable.
Yeah, so when that request is deemed unreasonable, that's not the end of the conversation, right?
Definitely not.
So that's an opportunity for the housing provider to engage in what we call the interactive process, which is just a conversation to find out what can be done to meet the individual with the disability's needs. So I'd love to invite both of you to talk a little bit about the interactive process and how to go about that.
Do you want to go first?
Sure, yeah. Yeah, so I would recommend not automatically saying no to a request. So definitely trying to understand why they have the request, right? Learning more and working toward a solution. So you could ask for other information. Maybe the individual needs more time to go to a different doctor, right? So allowing them to do that. If they need to have different accommodations for them to better understand the process. Yeah, it's tricky, but yeah, I think
The
not
key-
automatically saying no and kind of denying is definitely
I think
important.
the keynote is to keep the communication going.
Mhm. Yeah.
Keep the conversation going on both parts.
Yeah. So like even the landlord you were talking about who suggested the guinea pig, maybe that made sense to him, but that's not what we were asking for, right?
Exactly.
So,
Okay, fantastic. So what do you think are some aspects of the reasonable accommodation that housing providers might misunderstand? I know, Sharon, you highlighted a little bit from your own personal experience, but what are some other aspects that you think there might be some misunderstanding among housing providers?
yeah. So I'll go. So some housing providers, especially large property management groups, may choose to create their own kind of formal process or procedure for requesting accommodations. I know Inglis has housing properties, and we have kind of a smooth system for that. But here's the key: it cannot be overly burdensome, and you cannot ask invasive questions. And also, a tenant does not have to go through that procedure to still ask for that accommodation. So even if you set up this procedure, again, a tenant does not have to go through that. Another really common misconception is that not all employees have to be trained on fair housing laws and procedures. They do. So this comes up a lot with like maintenance workers maybe around. They go into the units with folks, maybe they're chatting, and an individual asks, oh, can I get a bar in my shower? That ask alone is considered a request, a reasonable modification request. Even though they didn't go through a separate procedure, they didn't necessarily ask the landlord, it was one of the maintenance workers, it is still considered a lawful request.
And it can be a verbal, it doesn't have to be in writing. It
Absolutely.
doesn't have to be certified.
Yep, it can absolutely be verbal, does not have to be written. I recommend your clients write for it in written, in email so that they have that protection, but it technically does not have to be. And the housing provider is still expected to respond in a reasonable timeline. So making sure that they, on their end, are keeping notes of these asks. Another aspect that I think more folks should recognize is that you can't deny, right? You can deny. You can't delay is what I meant to say. I'm so sorry. You can't delay a request. It still has to go through kind of the review process. You can't add on fees. So like he mentioned, maybe a pet fee. Pet fees are not included when it comes to assistance animals. Again, because they're not necessarily pets, right? They're considered medical equipment in that sort of way. Which I know is kind of weird, but that's how it's lawfully kind of considered. The delay is a big aspect, as well as kind of the formal procedure, I would say. And there's lots of uncertainty around fair housing for both tenants and housing providers. So I think I would encourage them to reach out and ask for that clarification.
Yeah, Sharon, do you have anything to add in your work with landlords?
I think she covered a lot, but the biggest thing is getting access to them once going back to the landlord will agree, but getting access to that is a huge barrier. Because one, if somebody needs a ramp and the landlord says, okay, not only the financial, but how do I know the regulations, the height,
Mm-hmm.
and because there's certain heights needs certain, and we have a team at Dawn that actually deals with this, but if it's the doorway's up so much, then it has to be a certain length, and if you hire Cousin Joe to do it, it might not have enough weight barrier. So that's a big barrier to me I've come across.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, that sounds pretty technical to make sure that you've got the right specs in place to make sure that it's safe and compliant with the codes. I do want to highlight that there is a resource that was put out by HUD in 2020 that's a really helpful guide for housing providers on how to assess these requests. It's on the HUD website, and when we send the follow-up information from this conference, I'll make sure to link to that as well. But it is framed to give a lot of helpful information covering a lot of the things that we were just talking about, and it's I recommend checking it out. So we've talked about things that housing providers might have questions on. Now we're going to change over to the tenant side. Based on your work with tenants and other providers, what are some aspects of this process that you feel that tenants just might not fully understand? And Sharon, I'll have you go first on this one.
Well, the biggest thing, I think, is their rights.
Mm-hmm.
They do not understand their rights. They feel that they have to try to adapt or go without, and also a tenant kind of feels powerless. You know, if they hit a wall, then I have to go somewhere else. I have to move. I have to start a new life. A couple people I've dealt with, when they had a home that they raised their family with, and they don't want to give it up, so they end up living in the living room and the kitchen, and that's it.
Mm-hmm.
And they don't realize that there's stair lifts, there's grab bars. I had one elderly couple, they were actually taking sponge baths in the kitchen sink because they didn't know about the grab bars of the shower adjustments. And we were able to sign them up for a grant, which they got, and they were able to take showers again.
Amazing.
Yeah, and that makes such a huge impact on someone's life, the ability to use your restroom to take a shower.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah, Olivia, what do you have to add on the tenant side of things?
Yeah, so I definitely think education on both sides is one of the major concerns here. So tenants not knowing their rights, and also assuming that their landlord or their housing provider does know fair housing laws. So I think approaching it is difficult, right? Folks with disabilities are probably used to advocating for themselves, and they may have some protective behaviors, right? So maybe they feel defensive and they're aggressive in that initial ask. I would be, right? But I think reminding themselves, remembering that this landlord, this housing provider may not have this education, and may need to kind of go back and do some research themselves. That is a big one. And also for them, recognizing that it is an interactive process, right? So not giving up after the first no or the first kind of confusion, or maybe ask, right? So being persistent, making good documentation is always a good recommendation for really anything. But yeah, I think those would be the main kind of things that folks misunderstand or don't realize. And then otherwise, it's just not reaching out to resources that they have. I think that is always a challenge, is in empowering folks to advocate for themselves, reach out for the support that they need.
All right. So a common theme throughout this whole conversation has been communication, right? It takes both parties working back and forth to be able to get this request successfully accommodated. Where do you think are the biggest points of breakdown? Like in your work, what have you seen? Like where are the main pain points that we could target to help this communication process go more smoothly?
I would say taking part. We all have our jobs, and I imagine most of us have heavy caseloads. But coming to conferences like this, getting out, going to the resource tables today, getting out, sometimes our knowledge is limited, but if we reach out to other organizations, they have a different aspect and a different outlook on the situation. So I think reaching out to other people in the fields is an important aspect, don't you?
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. So much of our work is really siloed. So yeah, exposing yourself to other kind of aspects and resources within the housing kind of system, though, I would say the breakdown in communication a lot of times between tenants and landlords comes when you don't already have kind of an established communication. So my landlord texts me. It works great because I have a paper trail at the end of the day, right? He's a great guy, so it works out for us. But if if your client has a landlord who likes to just talk in person or likes to call them, there are strategies for how to make sure that there is still that paper trail. So maybe they follow up after the phone call with an email saying like, hey, thanks for chatting with me today. I just want to make sure, confirm what we talked about. That way they do have that kind of history there and it's established. Yeah, I would say that was the big one. And then, yeah, reaching out for support. Yeah, breakdown in communication. It's challenging. It's like putting cats and dogs together sometimes. So it's yeah, you have to be persistent, and that would be my biggest kind of recommendations. Be persistent, clear, and follow up with a paper trail.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to acknowledge that there is the possibility for conflict, because sometimes there are housing providers that might not understand, might not want to grant that accommodation. But I think the way we approach it is that it can be a win-win situation for both the landlord and the tenant. So the tenant gets their needs met and housing that they can live stably in that meets their needs, and then the landlord has a stable tenant. So they've got that income stability and can continue to run a successful business as well. So I think that reframing can also be helpful.
Definitely, yeah.
So we focused a lot of this conversation on the landlord-tenant relationship, and I think that's really key in this topic. But I also want to highlight that reasonable accommodations can also involve local governments as well. So Olivia, would you want to share a little bit about reasonable accommodations that would involve local governments?
Yeah, absolutely. So this does come up actually quite often. And there is some moving kind of legislation, especially right now, around it. But it comes up often in kind of zoning policies or land use and zoning laws. So these can be exclusionary sometimes. So when we think about group homes for folks with disabilities, these would be protected by the Fair Housing Act, right? Because it's a disabled person. Many kind of zoning policies and land use policies exclude a certain number of individuals over the age of 18 from living together. Again, this isn't going to work when it comes to a group home for folks with disabilities. So this may lead to kind of that disproportionate kind of discrimination towards folks with disabilities by zoning them out. So again, it's kind of an example would be blocking the building of a group home for folks with disabilities or multifamily affordable housing units. A lot of people call this NIMBY, or not in my backyard. This can be exclusionary, right? And it can support that it is being discriminatory and against the Fair Housing Act in that way. It varies county to county. It can vary city to city even when it comes to zoning. So that's when it's important to reach out to your regional housing coordinators to know the policies in your area. Going to zoning meetings can be very interesting. It's also a great place to advocate for individuals, as well as your county commissioners, and knowing kind of the key players in your area. They're making decisions every day that impact your clients. Zoning, it can also come up, I live in Philadelphia. Folks still need accessible parking in Philly. So even in areas with unmarked kind of parking, you can request a accessible spot. So things like that, you can appeal to, your city or your municipality to get that moved across or get that granted. But yeah, I would say kind of looking out for exclusionary zoning and land use is a big fair housing concern for folks with disabilities. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that information. So, Sharon, I know you work every day with your consumers, helping them to be able to advocate for themselves. Do you have any strategies that you could share about advocating with local governments and navigating those processes?
Well, the first step I would do is your local representative, especially the girls or the guys in the office, because they bring to the representative what needs attention. So if you can kind of work with them on a friendly basis, appeal to them, even stop in and talk to them. And then, like you said, the county commissioners, I mean, they're the ones that run the county. And if you can get with them and just introduce yourself to them and say, look, we're dealing with this. My consumers are facing these issues. They're going to be on board. The majority of them are going to be on board. But I would start with the local and then go to the county.
All right, thank you. So a lot of our conversation today has been approaching these requests on these changes that need to be made. But I also want to bring into our conversation the concept of universal accessibility. So how we're designing and creating housing that's going to more broadly meet the needs of a wider range of tenants and residents. So we wouldn't need to make as many of these changes and navigate this process as often. Do you have any recommendations for any housing providers or developers who are in the room when they're thinking about designing their units, how we can design units that are going to meet the needs of tenants with disabilities?
Well, my opinion is when they're starting to develop, they're increasing their value and their market by making the facility ADA compatible. Because one, if you get somebody in there maybe in their 30s or 40s, and as they age, they're going to need more accessibility. So you have long-term tenants.
Yeah, that tenant stability is going to lead to income stability for the housing
Correct.
provider.
Yes.
Absolutely. Yeah, our data shows increasingly that folks are aging in this state, right? And we know the connection between aging and disability. I hope I live long enough to become disabled, truly. And our housing stock is woefully unprepared, especially in Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, these older cities. Beautiful, gorgeous architecture, beautiful hills, right? But it's hard when you're physically disabled. So considering that as a housing provider is incredibly profitable, folks are less likely to move as often. So that's less flipping that a landlord, a housing provider has to do. So there are some really great kind of blueprints when it comes to building with accessibility in mind. So one kind of key idea is the universal design. So this is design not just with folks with disabilities in mind, but truly for everyone, right? So you think about a curb cut on a sidewalk. That's helpful for folks who are pushing strollers, who are carrying their groceries. It's helpful for clumsy people like me, right? It helps everyone when we make these things better. So considering even accessibility in your design choices when it comes to it. So instead of doorknobs, having door handles, right? Easier to open. Having less cabinets under the sink so that someone could roll underneath it, right? Or could sit and do your dishes. That sounds great. So kind of considering things, maybe you don't have the funding to start from scratch, right? And build up. But even small design choices can make your unit much more accessible to someone. And if you are doing new construction, there's a ton of resources out there for you. There is a new construction accessibility requirements from the Fair Housing Act directly. There's also the concept of fair housing accessibility first, and that's another model for building accessible housing. But I do know from the limited kind of construction understanding, it's much easier to begin with accessibility in mind rather than retrofitting. We have a home modification program under Inglis, and a lot of times what they're finding is that before they can start modifications, so many houses need repairs to get there. So something to think about as a landlord, as a social service provider. Yes, they may need modification, but is your home in a really safe, stable place that would even allow that? So yeah, it's definitely challenging, but there is a lot of benefit to it. Your market greatly increases, your kind of pool of tenants greatly increases. And it's, yeah, if you appeal to that kind of business side of it for the housing provider, it's definitely marketable, and it's definitely, I would say, a worthwhile investment.
All right, fantastic. Well, I feel like we've covered a lot of ground in our conversation so far. Is there anything that you feel like we've missed in our conversation? Anything that our audience should be aware of?
I will just state it again, because I'm someone who needs to read things over and over again. So I just want to clarify, the Fair Housing Act covers both reasonable accommodations and reasonable modifications. So the accommodation, again, is a change in that policy, rule, or procedure, whereas a reasonable modification is a physical change to the structure. Now, a landlord or housing provider must allow a modification but does not have to pay for it. So that can be incredibly challenging, and also where I recommend you reach out to your local regional housing coordinator for resources. But yeah, we are here for any questions you may have, and I will definitely link you to further education for fair housing, because it's always changing, right? There's new laws happening, there's new case law being built almost every day. So it's definitely something you should try and stay abreast of, and we're here to help you with that.
Sharon, do you have anything to add?
I think that's excellent input. I think we covered a lot. I hope we didn't overwhelm you. But I would like to emphasize communication is the main thing that with fair housing, and to, like, there's certain things that the average person doesn't know is covered under the Fair Housing Act.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, and I want to emphasize that in addition to the Fair Housing Act, also in the state of Pennsylvania, we have the Pennsylvania Human Relations Act, which is very near and dear to the staff at PHRC, as well as all Pennsylvanians. I would hope that's our state law that ensures protections in the space of housing, as well as public accommodations, employment, education, and commercial properties as well. So there may be folks that have tried to go through this reasonable accommodation process and ran into issues. And I want you to know that PHRC is a resource for you as well. If you believe that that a housing provider has unfairly denied a reasonable accommodation, or you've experienced issues there, you can contact our agency. You can file a complaint. It's a completely free process, and we've got trained neutral staff that can walk you through it. So I want you to know that you have a resource at our agency. We also have a fair housing line that you can call, ask any questions that you might have, and we've got a lot of information, brochures, and training resources as well. But with that said, I think we are now at the point where we can open it up the floor for questions. So I'd invite anyone to either come to the center aisle and voice your question at a mic, or my colleague, Amanda Brothman, our Director of Communications, can bring the mic around to you if you would prefer. So you can also raise your hand as well.
More of a comment, I guess, is an observation. Something that you had mentioned, Olivia, towards the end was education. And being a housing provider, one thing that we've come across with tenants is not so much a lack of awareness that they have the rights and that there's resources out there, but a lack of understanding on their part that just because they have a disability and they make a request, they're not entitled to it. And that can having that misunderstanding can kind of create an adversarial right off of the bat, where we're trying to explain that, no, we can't install a private elevator for you just because
Right.
you can't be around people.
Yeah.
So I think that was one of the big things that you had mentioned was not just awareness, but education as well, because it does work both ways.
Yeah,
Yes,
absolutely.
Thank you.
Absolutely, yeah. It's a huge challenge and kind of a misunderstanding when it comes to the housing process, for sure. Hey.
Hello. Since you all are doing this work every day, I'm just curious about what some of the most common issues you see are, like most requested reasonable accommodations, common roadblocks you might run into with landlords or certain types of landlords. What kind of things are people bringing to you?
Yeah, so I will say assistance animals is huge. So there is quite a market for these like fake certificates sort of things. So that is a really common challenge that we see on both landlord and tenant side again. Folks either faking it or, and it's hard to say fake, right? But they are not verified. So that's a large one. So understanding what kind of proof or verification the housing provider can ask for and what that individual should be providing. Don't let them waste money on a fake certificate, right? Go to the doctor, discuss it. I would say that's a large one. And then when it comes to the modifications, really the bathroom is a major place where we're seeing a lot of modifications are necessary. You think about your activities of daily living and taking care of yourself. And one of the most basic things is hygiene, right? And being able to clean yourself. So making sure that your tenants do have that and are able to request for that modification. But that is a really common area where folks experience a lot of challenges. Yeah.
I agree.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, the ramps.
Yeah. Yep. Getting out of the house.
Getting out
Yeah.
of the house. I've had several people, they're stranded.
Yeah.
You know, they're in their home and they can't get out. The ramp was built by a friend and wasn't strong enough to hold the wheelchair.
Yep.
Mm.
Yeah.
So those are the biggest, like you said, ramps and the bathroom.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And people, again, buy things online and they buy these grab bars with the suction.
The suction cups.
And they're not reliable, they don't hold a lot of weight.
Mhm.
And, they'll fall down when nobody's in the room, let
Mhm.
alone somebody putting weight on it and lifting himself off the toilet.
There actually was a pretty big case where a landlord did offer suction cup grab bars. And it was, I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, Brittany, but there was a large fine associated with it because it was not safe at all. I'm not sure if the individual got hurt in that case, but someone could have, definitely. So,
Yeah, that's a huge safety issue. Approaching it from a little different perspective, I would say the differential access to education for housing providers is a pretty big challenge and a barrier that I see in my work. A lot of larger housing providers have access to a lot of training resources. There's tons of online trainings that you can purchase, and a lot of the big property management companies make sure to cover their liability by making sure their whole teams get trained. Whereas some of our smaller landlords that might own just a couple properties might not be fully aware of the training resources that are out there. They might not be fully aware of their fair housing responsibilities. So PHRC is putting a strong emphasis on trying to do a lot of outreach in those landlord communities to make sure that folks are fully aware of all of the free trainings that we offer. And of course, there's also excellent free trainings that are offered from Inglis as well that I want to highlight too. But that's a great question. We still have a couple minutes if there's any other questions that folks have or anything that you would want to share on the topic. Yep, and then we'll go for you next.
Hi, good morning. So you mentioned smaller landlords not being perhaps familiar with their requirements. I was just curious if there's a set number of properties, like what coverage is with under the Fair Housing Act, and the Human Relations Act of Pennsylvania? If you could comment on that.
Yeah, absolutely. So under the Fair Housing Act, or I'm sorry, Olivia, did you want to take that?
You,
Or?
you got it.
Okay. So under the Fair Housing Act, there is that exemption for housing providers with 3 or fewer properties, but that doesn't exist for the Human Relations under the Human Relations Act. Additionally, there's no exemption for advertising, so you couldn't have any discriminatory advertising, and housing providers that receive federal funds are covered by the Fair Housing Act and the Human Relations Act, no matter how many properties they have. Great question. Could you run the mic over? Thank you.
Hello, I'm sorry I arrived a little bit too late, but I have 2 questions I hope they can be answered. The question about accommodations. In a private apartment building with private ownership, do they still have to comply to ADA requirements as they are said in their laws?
They do need to make reasonable accommodations and to follow the ADA. Absolutely.
Or does that include like the ADA compliant restrooms and things, or just getting into the building?
That would include restrooms as well
Mhm.
for all properties that would fall under the ADA.
Okay, thank you. And then the separate question, second question is, and I don't know if your housing or anything could answer, but I just came out of a workshop that was more geared towards renters, justice, and things, helping people who had landlord issues and things. But when I heard URA on one of the panel discussions, I didn't have time to ask a question, but they have funds that have available for people to have accessibility by ramps and things into their homes. But then they turn around on the other side and say that you cannot get the funds that are, or the grants requested unless you are living in the home. But you cannot get in the home if you don't have the ramp.
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of complicated. Can you address that?
Yeah, I haven't faced that, but that does sound incredibly challenging. I would be curious if, I think it depends on which building. So is the building providing that modification, or is it a separate program?
Or your own home? Are you saying your own home?
Mhm. Mm. Yeah, so it really depends on the specific program. Unfortunately, it's going to come down to who's providing that home modification. But that's a great point. How can I prepare to live in this space? How can I request that service if I need to have all this proof, right? I think that's what yeah. That's a huge challenge and a huge flaw kind of in our system. And it speaks to why we should be building accessible housing from the get-go. In that case, I would really encourage you to reach out to the housing provider to see if they could still provide that. Is there a way you could start your lease without moving in to get that kind of verification that you need in order to receive that service? But I know that's costly. At the end of the day, it's a very costly process. So yeah, it's definitely a challenge. Yeah, and so homeowners, yeah, that's also a challenge. So some programs absolutely do still cover the modifications for a homeowner. But again, you need to think about, is your home structured so that it can actually be modified, right? Is it in good repair? Because that is something that we do come across when we're doing modifications, is that a lot of homes require repairs before we can even get to modifying anything. So, yeah, I think you bring up a lot of like systemic issues that we have when it comes to accessibility in housing, and those are the kind of gaps that people fall through, right? So if you are running a program but you require proof of address, right, and that they be there, and yet it's inaccessible, that's why we're reaching out, right? How can I be there if it's inaccessible? So yeah, I think you're highlighting a big gap. Yeah, so I great point. Yeah, let's figure it out. There are many agencies that do provide modifications. Myself, my agency does so, depending on, the situation. But yeah, there are services that can provide support and funding for it, but it is a huge gap. Any other recommendations?
Do you have anything, Brittany?
No, I think you covered it pretty well. I think we need to, as for the folks that are in decision-making capacities for those grants, for those funding, it's important to consider that. So if you are seeing programs that have these inherent barriers, I'd encourage you to reach out and to let them know. So that way, as they're making adjustments to their programs and their grants, they can have that helpful input so that the programs are actually helpful and accessible. All right, so I think at this point, we are going to close out our discussion. I'm going to invite Amanda Brothman to come up here because we've got some plaques for our panelists to thank you for your contributions today and for sharing your expertise with us. And then we'll have just a